Namaskar. Well, friends, I heartily welcome you all to Bhim, Bhashya, my audio-video podcast series on Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar. This audio-visual podcast series has 54 short speeches on Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar, unraveling as many as 25 different dimensions of his multi-dimensional genius. Friends, this podcast series is focused on Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar, his thoughts, his actions, his philosophy, and above all, the kind of grand vision that he has shown for the country as a whole. That is what this podcast series is all about. So let's proceed. Well, friends, as discussed in the last episode, the process of formation of the Constituent Assembly took almost 12 years from the first official demand that was made by Congress in 1934 to the actual election of the Constituent Assembly in 1946. Until the last minute, Dr. Ambedkar was almost sure that he was not going to find a place in the Constituent Assembly. So, in the intervening period, what did he do? He wrote the Constitution himself. The Constitution that was written by Dr. Ambedkar himself was titled as States and Minorities. In March 1947, this was submitted as a memorandum to the Constituent Assembly. It would be very interesting to take a look at his own version of the Indian Constitution. Dr. Ambedkar's Constitution was couched in the form of articles of the Constitution of United States of India and presented along with several explanatory notes and statistical material. Dr. Ambedkar's non-official version of the Indian Constitution comprised a preamble and 4 articles, each with several sections and each section containing multiple parts or multiple clauses. The Article 1 of the proposed non-official constitution had 2 sections with a total 6 clauses dealing with a range of delicate issues related to the admission of 600 plus princely states into the United States of India. Article 2 of the unofficial constitution proposed by Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar, it had 4 sections with altogether 12 clauses. The first section deals with remedies against invasion of fundamental rights. As we have seen earlier, it was very important for Dr. Ambedkar that announcement of fundamental right is one thing, but remedy against its invasion is very, very important, which was missing earlier. He brought in his version of the Constitution. And these remedies, there were 4 clauses. First, judicial protection. Second, protection against unequal treatment. Third, protection against discrimination. 4, protection against economic exploitation. As indicated in the explanatory notes, the first clause, the clause relating to judicial protection, and I quote him, proposes to give protection to citizens against the abuse of authority by the executive. Unquote. Clause 2 is on protection against unequal treatment. This aims at ensuring that, and I quote, all citizens shall have equal benefit of laws, rules, and regulations. Clause 3 recognizes discrimination and these are the words of Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar. The main purpose behind this clause is to put an obligation on the state to plan the economic life of people on lines which will lead to highest point of productivity without, and I put special emphasis on that, without closing every avenue to private enterprise, and also provide for equitable distribution of wealth. Unquote. Please do understand that that was the time when there was massive nationalization going around everywhere and big talk about Russian Revolution and the great benefits that it had achieved. Dr. Ambedkar did not go for wholesale nationalization. He talked about the highest possible productivity without closing every avenue for private enterprise. This is something which must be noted. This clause 4 proposes state ownership in agriculture with a collectivized method of cultivation and a modified form of state socialism in the field of industry. These are his words. It also proposes to nationalize insurance. As explained by Dr. Ambedkar, and I quote him, the plan has two special features. One is that it proposes state socialism in important fields of economic life. The second special feature of the plan is that it does not leave, and this is very important, it does not leave the establishment of state socialism to the will of the legislature. It establishes state socialism by the law of constitution and thus makes it unalterable by any act of the legislature and the executive. Dr. Ambedkar points out in his unofficial version of the Indian Constitution that the challenge is to have, and I quote him, state socialism without dictatorship, to have state socialism with parliamentary democracy. And the only way out is, and I quote Dr. Ambedkar again, is to retain parliamentary democracy and to prescribe state socialism by the law of the constitution so that it will be beyond the reach of the parliamentary majority to suspend, amend, or abrogate it. Thus, he says, and I quote him again, one can achieve the triple object, namely to establish socialism, to retain parliamentary democracy, and avoid dictatorship. The third section of Article 2 covers provisions for the protection of minority in 4 clauses. Clause 1 is protection against communal executive. Clause 2, protection against social and official tyranny. Clause 3, protection against social boycott. Clause 4, authority and obligation of the union and state governments to spend money for public purposes, including purposes beneficial to the minorities. The fourth section of Article 2 dealt with safeguards for scheduled caste. This section had 5 parts, each with multiple clauses. Part A covered guarantees to the scheduled caste with 3 clauses. Clause 1, right to representation in legislature and in the local bodies. Clause 2, right to representation in the executive. And clause 3, right to representation in services. Part B of the unofficial constitution deals with special responsibilities. This part has 2 clauses covering 1, higher education, and 2, separate settlement for scheduled caste, that is to say, earmarking adequate financial resources for scheduled castes. What I have presented here is simply a trailer, a kind of insight into what was in mind of Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar if he were to write the constitution by himself. So his priorities all come through, and very specific provisions which came about from on the basis of his long-standing experience and the insights that he had earned in the course of his life. Well, friends, we can conclude our session here. But before I leave, let me say this, that if you like this audio-visual podcast series, please like it, please share it, please subscribe to it. So long until we meet again. Thank you. Dhanyavad.